Have you ever asked yourself what your friendship is worth? For my best friend since childhood, the answer is $3,000. That's the price she got when she drugged and sold me, the maid of honor at my own wedding, to a brothel in Las Vegas. This is not a movie. This is a true story about the most horrific betrayal a woman can endure, about 3 years of hell on earth, and a seemingly impossible journey for justice. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they might shake your faith. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. It was 1969. I was 23 years old, with long black hair that reached my waist, dreams as big as the California sky, and a pain in my chest the size of the Grand Canyon. I had found out a few days before that Michael, my husband of 4 years, the one who swore eternal love at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, was cheating on me with a young woman who worked at the bank. It wasn't because I heard gossip, no. I caught the two of them together in his office on a Thursday when I decided to show up by surprise with an apple pie I had just taken out of the oven. The pie fell to the floor when I opened the door and saw them. To this day, I can't smell apple pie without remembering that scene. Back then, in a small town, everyone found out about everything. Soon, the story spread through Napa like a flash flood. People looked at me with that look of pity, mixed with curiosity. They whispered when I passed by. It was a torment just to step outside. I locked myself at home and cried until I had no tears left. It was at that moment that Penelope appeared, as she always did in the difficult moments of my life. A friend since we were 7 years old, we had grown up together, played with dolls together, dreamed about the future together. She was my maid of honor at my wedding. She was the godmother of my first child that I lost before he was born. If there was anyone I trusted in this world, it was Penelope. "Josephine," she said to me, sitting on the edge of my bed, where I had been for 3 days with almost no food. "You can't be like this, my flower. You need to get out of this room, this city, breathe some fresh air." She held my hand in hers, those green eyes looking at me with what I thought was genuine concern. "I have an idea. My cousin is going to Las Vegas next week, for work. He knows a cheap hotel there off the Strip. We could go, stay for a week, see the shows, away from these gossipy people, away from Michael. Just you and me, like the old times." The idea of leaving Napa, of not having to face the stares, the whispers, of not having to see Michael with the other woman around town, seemed like a dream. "Let's go," I agreed, not imagining that I was signing my own death warrant. My purse and valuables were gone, but my small suitcase had been emptied and its contents tossed in a corner. Among the discarded clothes, I saw it. The simple cotton dress where I had hidden the necklace. They must have deemed it worthless. With immense relief, I pulled it out and checked the lining. The necklace was still there. It was this necklace that kept me alive for the next 3 years. The trip started peacefully. We took the Greyhound bus from Napa to Sacramento, then another one that went straight to Las Vegas. It was a long journey, more than 20 hours on the road. Penelope had brought sandwiches, water, cookies. We talked about our school days, laughed remembering our mischief, and avoided talking about Michael. When night fell, she took a thermos from her bag. "Fresh coffee," she said, offering me some, to keep us awake a little longer, to see the moonlight on the road. I loved coffee. I drank it with pleasure, tasting the strong flavor and something different that I didn't identify at the time. Perhaps you're thinking, how could I have been so naive? But you see, when your heart is shattered and you feel like you're drowning, you don't look for poison in the only cup of water someone offers you. You just drink it, with a kind of blind gratitude. I only know that minutes later my vision started to get blurry, my tongue heavy. "I think I'm feeling sick," I managed to say before everything went dark. If I had known that that coffee on the bus would be the last thing I would drink in freedom for 3 years, I would have jumped from that moving bus. I would have screamed, fought, done anything. But I didn't know. I trusted a friendship I thought was more solid than the rocks of Napa and paid a price that no woman should ever have to pay. What happened after I passed out on the bus, I only found out much later, when I was already in that Vegas hell. Penelope had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The coffee was drugged with a strong sleeping medicine. When I arrived unconscious in Vegas, we didn't go to any hotel. Her cousin, who was actually no cousin at all but a human trafficker, carried me to a rundown house in a seedy part of the city. From there, they took me to the brothel, moving me through the back streets where no one would ask any questions. When I woke up in that filthy room in Las Vegas, I had already been sold for $3,000 to the owner of a brothel that specialized in foreign women. The first week is a blur in my memory. I remember crying until I had no more tears, begging, trying to explain that there had been a mistake, that I had a family in the United States, that they needed to let me go back. They laughed. The owner of the place, a fat man named Walter, explained to me with complete calm, as if he were talking to a child. There was no mistake, American girl. He came closer, his breath smelling of cigarettes and something sweet. Your friend Penelope sold you to me. I paid a total of $3,000 for you. She got her $1,000 cut. Now, you owe me the remaining $2,000, plus your food and lodging. You will work until you pay off your debt. But the debt never decreased. Every meal, every dress they forced me to wear, every time I got sick and needed medicine, everything was added up. A few days later, when I was still refusing to work, I was beaten for the first time. Not by Walter. He didn't get his hands dirty. It was one of the security guards, a man with a scar that cut across his face from his eye to his chin. He didn't say anything while he beat me. He didn't have to. The message was clear. The illusion of choice is brutally stripped away, replaced by the simple, horrifying language of violence. Her spirit was the real target of this beating. Let's find out if they succeeded in breaking her. The first client was a nightmare that to this day I can't talk about without trembling. A middle-aged man, big belly, sweaty hands. I closed my eyes and clung to the necklace hidden in my dress, praying to die, to wake up, for anything to get me out of there. You learn to leave your own body. It's a strange trick the mind plays to protect itself. You float up to a corner of the ceiling and watch the terrible scene below, telling yourself it's happening to someone else. The only problem is, it's very hard to learn how to come back down afterwards. But I didn't die. I didn't wake up because I was already awake in the real nightmare. When he left, I vomited until only bile was left in my mouth. One of the other women, a Mexican woman named Isabella, who had been there for 5 years, helped me clean up, gave me water. "Don't cry, sister," she said. "Save your tears. You'll need them for worse things." She was right. Worse things came, much worse. The brothel wasn't like the ones in the movies, all lit up, with beautiful women smiling. It was a dirty, violent place, where we were treated like merchandise with an expiration date. There were women from various countries: the United States, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, even some from Eastern Europe. Most had been brought with false promises of employment. Some had been kidnapped, others sold like me. No one ever left. The doors were locked, the windows had bars. There were always at least 2 armed men on guard. The first time I tried to escape was a month after I arrived. I had managed to steal a key from one of the cleaning ladies. I waited until early morning when the traffic was lighter. I almost made it to the back door. Almost. The punishment was 2 days in a sort of basement, without food, without water, in the dark. When they took me out of there, I could barely stand. "Next time," Walter said, blowing cigar smoke in my face, "I'll break your legs. A woman doesn't need legs to work here. She just needs to lie down." What kept me alive in those first few months, besides the hidden necklace, was my knowledge of languages. My father had a small winery and gift shop in Napa, which received tourists and foreign buyers. Since I was little, I was exposed to many languages like Spanish and even a little French. In the brothel, this became an advantage. I could understand what the men said to each other, what the owners were planning. Information, I discovered, was power, even if small, even if hidden. I also made friends with other women, forming a silent network of support. We would trade food when one was being punished without meals. We took care of each other's wounds. We whispered stories of home in the few hours of rest, promising that one day we would return. But there were nights when that promise felt like a lie. Nights when the darkness of the room merged with the darkness in my soul. I remember one night, after a particularly brutal client, I lay on the lumpy mattress and felt nothing but an echoing emptiness. I thought about letting go, about simply fading away. It seemed easier than facing another sunrise in that hell. But then my fingers brushed against the secret stitching in my dress. I pulled out my grandmother's necklace. In the faint moonlight from the barred window, the rosewood beads felt warm, real. I closed my eyes and didn't pray for rescue. I prayed for strength. I pictured my father's face, his calloused hands that ran a business with honesty. And I whispered to myself, I am Josephine Thompson from Napa, California. I am my father's daughter. It wasn't a prayer. It was a declaration of war against despair. That necklace wasn't just wood. It was my anchor. Many never did. Some died right there from untreated illnesses, from beatings that went too far, from suicide when they couldn't take it anymore. I learned to save my crying for the night, biting my pillow so no one would hear. During the day, I kept my eyes dry and my mind alert, looking for a way out, a loophole, anything. The second escape attempt was almost a year later. We had planned it for months. Me, Isabella, and a Paraguayan woman named Sofia. We managed to bribe one of the new guards with jewelry that clients had given us. He promised to leave the back door open on a specific night and look the other way. At the appointed time, we crept silently down the service stairs. The door was open, as promised, but when we stepped onto the street, lights came on. Men appeared from all sides. The guard had betrayed us, telling Walter the plan in exchange for more money. The punishment this time was worse, much worse. I was separated from the others, taken to a room in the back that I didn't even know existed. I spent 2 weeks there being disciplined. When I returned to the room I shared with 3 other women, even Isabella didn't recognize me at first. I had lost almost 30 pounds. My face was deformed by bruises. 2 fingers on my left hand had been broken and never straightened out again. But the worst part wasn't the visible marks. It was what they did to my soul. For a while after that, I believed I had died in that room, and what was left was just an empty shell. It was in this darkest period that I met David, an American merchant who regularly visited Las Vegas on business. He became a frequent client, always asking for me. At first I hated him like all the others, but gradually I noticed something different. He treated me with a minimum of kindness. Nothing extraordinary in the normal world, but in the hell where I lived, it was like water in the desert. He was never violent. He always asked if he was hurting me. Sometimes he would just pay for the hours to talk in English, to quench his homesickness for his mother tongue. It took me months to trust him enough to tell him my story. When I finally did, I saw something change in his eyes, a mixture of horror and compassion that seemed genuine. "I'm going to help you," he whispered one night, so low I could barely hear. "I can't do anything directly or they'll get suspicious, but I have a plan. I need you to trust me." Trust. It was a word I thought I'd forgotten the meaning of after 3 years in hell. But when you're at the bottom of a dark, empty well, and someone lowers a single, fragile thread, you don't question its strength. You just grab hold and pray. Trust was something I no longer knew how to do. But what choice did I have? The plan was risky, but simple. David traveled regularly between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, carrying packages, product samples. On his next trip, he would take a small package to an address in the United States, a small box of local crafts that he would buy right there in Las Vegas. Inside this box, he would hide a message from me with all the details of the brothel. My full name, where I was from, Penelope's name, everything. The address would be the FBI in Los Angeles. I wrote the message on a tiny piece of paper with letters so small it hurt my eyes to read. I hid it inside a wooden statuette that looked solid, but had a false bottom that David managed to create. It was a huge risk. If they found out, not only would I be killed, but David would be too. I handed him the statuette one night, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. "It will work," he promised. "Have faith." Faith was the only thing I had left, clinging to that hidden necklace. The following weeks were the longest of my life. Every noise at the door made me jump, imagining the police arriving, or worse, Walter discovering what we had done. David had said he would be back in a month, but a month passed and nothing. Then, too, I started to think I had been deceived again, that David had simply left and forgotten, or that he never intended to help. Hope is a cruel thing. It hurts more to lose it a second time. Then, one early morning like any other, I woke up to the sound of doors being broken down, screams, gunshots. My first thought was that it was a fight between rival gangs, something that happens sometimes. But then I heard something I hadn't heard in 3 years. Voices speaking English with an American accent. FBI, everyone on the ground. The rescue had finally arrived. The message had been delivered. David had kept his promise. What followed was a blur of lights, sirens, helicopters. We were all removed from the brothel, wrapped in blankets, taken to a safe location. There were doctors, psychologists, people from the State Department. I remember an FBI agent explaining to me that they had discovered an international human trafficking network, that it wasn't just that brothel, that there were dozens scattered throughout the Southwest. My message had been the missing piece to connect the dots of an investigation that had been going on for years. I returned to California 2 weeks later on a U.S. Air Force plane, along with 5 other American women rescued in the same operation. I was free, finally, but freedom is not simple. When you've spent 3 years in captivity, it's like a bird that has lived its whole life in a cage. When the door opens, it no longer knows how to fly, and the worst was yet to come. Because while I was fighting to survive in a brothel in Las Vegas, life in Napa had gone on. And what I discovered when I returned home was as painful as the years of captivity, maybe even more so, because it came from whom I least expected. So yes, it was Penelope, my childhood friend, who orchestrated my personal hell. I know what you're thinking. How? Why would anyone do that to their best friend? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't about a single moment of greed. It was a poison that had been seeping into our friendship for years, drop by drop. To understand the venom, you need to see the snake in its nest. You need to come back with me, to the very beginning, to the sun-drenched fields of Napa in 1946. And to understand why the snake bit, we need to know the nest where it was raised. I was born in Napa in 1946, when California was still a place where time moved slower than the rest of the world. My father, George Thompson, had a small winery and gift shop right on the town square, near St. Anthony's Church. He wasn't a man of great wealth, but he was respected in the city, known for his honesty in business. If he said that tourmaline was genuine, you could bet it was. My mother, Miss Clara, was an expert seamstress, the kind who could look at a person once and know all their measurements without a tape measure. She made wedding dresses so beautiful that young women would postpone their weddings until she had an opening in her busy schedule. Our house was simple, but we never lacked anything. Not food on the table, not love, not the education they never had the chance to receive. My father had only studied up to the 4th grade, but he was the most intelligent man I ever knew. He read everything that came his way, from old newspapers to books borrowed from the vicar. My mother barely knew how to write her name, but she could calculate yards of fabric and prices in her head faster than a math teacher. What marked me most in my childhood was the smell of my father's shop, that mix of wet earth, rough stone, and the leather of the displays. Since I was little, I would sit there on a stool behind the counter, watching the customers who came in. They weren't just people from the city, no. Buyers came from all over, people speaking with accents, languages I didn't even know existed, Japanese looking for aquamarine, Germans looking for imperial topaz, Canadians interested in rose quartz. That's how I learned my first gift, languages. It started as a game. A man with a mustache, a salesman from Los Angeles, who came by once a month, taught me to count to 10 inches Spanish. I found it so interesting that I started asking every foreigner who came in to teach me a new word. At 7 years old, I could already say good morning, how much does it cost, and thank you in 5 different languages. My father noticed my interest and began to encourage me, saying that knowing how to speak with foreigners could be good for business. When I turned 10, I got my first dictionary, a Portuguese-English one, that a retired teacher was selling at the market for a few cents. I spent the little money I saved from the coins customers gave me when I served coffee. That worn-out little book became my treasure. I took it everywhere, memorizing 5 words a day. Then came others. Spanish, French, even an Italian one that a priest gave me when he heard about my talent. It wasn't formal learning, it was more of a soup of words and expressions, but it worked. At 15, I could already hold simple conversations in 3 languages besides English. In school, I was always a diligent student. I wasn't the smartest in the class. That position belonged to Penelope. Ah, Penelope, how to explain this friendship that became my worst nightmare? We met on the first day of elementary school. Me, a shy girl, with poorly made braids and a little dress sewn by my mother. She, all dressed up, a ribbon in her hair, the daughter of the owner of the pharmacy, the only one in town at the time. We sat together because it was alphabetical order. Thompson, Fernandez. The friendship began when I shared my lunch with her. I had brought warm chocolate chip cookies that my mom had made early in the morning, still warm, smelling divine. Penelope looked at them with those huge green eyes, and I offered her a piece. "I've never had such delicious cookies," she said. Later I found out it was a lie. The cook at her house made cookies every single day, but at the time I believed her. Of course, children believe easily. We grew up together as if we were part of the same tree. From elementary school to middle school, from middle school to sweet 16 parties, from the first girlish dreams to plans for the future. Penelope was the pretty one. Curly, honey-colored hair, green eyes that everyone complimented, always dressed in the latest fashion that her mother ordered from Los Angeles. I was the smart one, the one who knew languages, the one who wrote essays that the teacher read aloud, the one who helped others with math. I didn't realize it at the time, but this difference was already planting a small seed of envy. When I received praise from the teachers, I would see a strange glint in her eyes. When a boy paid attention to me because of the way I spoke or the stories I made up, she would soon appear with a new dress, a different hairstyle, drawing attention to herself. I didn't see it as competition. I thought it was just her way, that we were different and complemented each other. At 17, I won a scholarship for a summer exchange program in France. A visiting professor was impressed with my French and arranged everything. I ran to tell Penelope, expecting her to share my joy. She looked at the acceptance letter in my hand, and for a moment, her bright green eyes hardened. "France," she said, forcing a smile. "How wonderful. You get to see the world, and I get to stay here in dusty Napa." She then added, almost under her breath, "Some people just have all the luck, don't they?" The words stung more than a slap. I tried to brush it off as simple disappointment, but it was the first time I felt the chill of a shadow in our friendship. I never knew how deep that shadow ran. The exchange was the most transformative experience of my youth. I came back different, more confident, speaking French almost without an accent, full of ideas. And it was shortly after my return that I met Michael. He had just graduated from law school at UCLA and returned to Napa to open an office. Son of a traditional family in the city, one of those with a last name on the town square. We met at a 4th of July barbecue. He asked me to square dance and didn't let me go all night. Michael was painfully handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that seemed to light up his whole face. But what really charmed me was the conversation. He had read the same books as me, had opinions on politics, on the future of the United States. I had never met a man like him. When I introduced Michael to Penelope, I saw that look again, more intense this time, almost as if something was burning inside her, but I was so in love that I let it pass. In the following weeks, whenever we met, she would ask about him, wanting to know details of our relationship, where we went, what we talked about. I thought it was a friend's interest, affection for my happiness. How foolish I was. The courtship was fast and intense. In 6 months, Michael was already talking about marriage. In a year, we were engaged. Penelope, of course, would be my maid of honor. Who else could it be? She helped with all the preparations, giving her opinion on the dress my mother made, more beautiful than any store-bought one, on the flowers, on the catering. On the wedding day, she was stunning in a green dress that matched her eyes. "You're going to steal the bride's thunder," I joked. "Never," she replied, hugging me. "Your day, your light." I got married at 19, thinking the world was a fair and good place, that people were what they seemed to be, that childhood friendships were eternal and inviolable. The honeymoon was in Lake Tahoe, a magical week visiting the sights, the museums, walking hand in hand on the slopes. When we returned, we settled into the house that Michael had inherited from his grandfather, a simple but charming little house, with blue windows and a backyard with an apple tree, near the center of town. The first years of marriage were happy, or at least I thought they were. I worked part-time at my father's shop, who was getting too old to take care of everything alone. The rest of the time I took care of the house, learned to cook things that Michael liked, and dreamed of the children we would have. Penelope would show up almost every day, always with a little cake, a new embroidery, some town gossip. She was always around. Too close, I realize now. There were so many signs I ignored. When we renovated the living room, she ran her hand over the new furniture, saying, "Wow, this must have cost a fortune, huh?" with that tone of voice that mixed admiration and something darker. When Michael won an important case and we celebrated, she would always mention how smart he was, how lucky I was to have found a man like him, how she was still looking for her Michael. Little hints, like pins that you only feel when they've already pierced your skin. The worst was when I got pregnant at 21. I was radiant. Michael, too. When I told Penelope, she smiled, hugged me, said all the right things, but I saw that glint in her eyes, stronger than ever. A week later, I had some bleeding. I lost the baby in the 3rd month of pregnancy. It was a pain I can't even explain. It felt like a piece of my soul had been ripped out. Penelope was there at the hospital holding my hand, saying that God knew what he was doing, that I would get pregnant again soon. I never got pregnant again. Years later, I found out that she had put something in the tea she served me days before the bleeding. One of the women at the brothel in Las Vegas, who had been a midwife before being kidnapped, recognized the symptoms when I told her. The marriage began to fall apart after the loss of the baby. Michael buried himself in work. He would come home late, increasingly distant. I blamed myself, thinking I had done something wrong, that my body had failed. Penelope was always around, comforting me, but also planting doubts. "Are you sure he's really working late?" Men sometimes seek comfort elsewhere when their wife is too sad. She never said it directly, always as if she meant nothing by it, always with that look of a concerned friend. The affair I discovered after 4 years of marriage was just the final nail in the coffin. That day with the apple pie I mentioned before was the complete humiliation. The girl from the bank was young, beautiful, with that energy I had lost after so much time trying to be the perfect wife without being able to give my husband a child. I couldn't even scream when I saw them. I simply dropped the pie, turned around, and walked home like a sleepwalker. The shame I felt afterward was worse than the betrayal itself. Napa, at the time, was a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. In 2 days, there wasn't a living soul who wasn't commenting on how Dr. Michael had been caught red-handed with a young woman from Bank of America. Women looked at me with pity, some sincere, others with that little taste of satisfaction at seeing that not even the perfect Josephine was immune to misfortune. The men averted their eyes, embarrassed or perhaps in solidarity with Michael. It was like being naked in the town square, exposed to everyone's eyes and judgments. That's when Penelope showed up with the travel plan. Now, looking back, I see how she planned everything meticulously. First, she isolated me. In the weeks after the discovery of the affair, she pushed other friends away with excuses that I needed space, that I was too fragile for visitors. Then she fed my shame and sadness, always reminding me how difficult it must be to meet acquaintances on the street, how the whole town must be talking. Finally, when I was completely vulnerable, locked in my house for almost a month, she proposed the solution: to escape for a few days, to get away from the stares, the whispers. "My cousin Frank is going to Las Vegas for work," she explained, sitting on the edge of my bed, where I had barely left for days. "He knows a cheap little hotel there off the strip. We could go together, stay for a week, see that wonder everyone talks about, away from these gossipy people, away from Michael and that tramp." She held my hand in hers, her green eyes staring at me with what seemed like sincere concern. Just the two of us, Josephine, like the old days. "Remember when we used to dream of seeing the world? Now's the time." The idea of leaving Napa, even for a few days, seemed like salvation. I couldn't stand being trapped in that house anymore, reliving memories, imagining Michael with the other woman. I couldn't bear the thought of facing the looks of pity at Sunday Mass, the whispers that stopped when I approached. "And the money?" I asked, worried. We didn't have a joint account, and my savings from my father's shop were small. "That's the least of our worries," Penelope assured me. "I have a little money saved up, and Frank can get a discount at the hotel because he's friends with the manager. The bus ticket isn't expensive, and we can bring sandwiches to eat on the road. It'll be a budget trip, but fun." She already had everything planned down to the smallest detail. The date, the bus schedule, how long we would stay, what we needed to bring. "It'll be just us girls," she guaranteed. "Frank will just introduce us at the hotel and go on his way. This is a trip for you to heal that heart, my friend." I accepted. How could I not? It was a lifeline being extended when I was drowning in sadness and humiliation. I spent the next few days packing a small suitcase, choosing simple but pretty clothes, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Penelope took care of everything, bought the tickets, confirmed with her cousin, even talked to my father to explain that I needed this trip to lift my spirits. The day before the trip, I went to St. Anthony's Church, not to pray for my marriage. I already knew it was over, that there was no going back after the public humiliation. I went to pray for myself, to ask for strength to start over, to find a new path after I returned from the trip. I knelt in the front pew, took my grandmother's wooden cross necklace from my pocket, the same one that would later save my sanity in the Las Vegas brothel. I remember looking at the altar and thinking, I need a sign, my God, a sign that everything will be okay. At that exact moment, a lady I had never seen before sat next to me. She was a simple woman, with a scarf on her head, her hands marked by hard work. She looked at me with kind eyes and said, out of the blue, "Beware of false friendship, my child. It's like a snake hiding in your boot. When you least expect it, the venom has already entered." That old woman's words in the church haunted me for years. Now I understand that it was the warning God sent me. Always listen to those warnings, whether they come from a stranger or from the whispering voice inside of you. A woman's intuition is rarely wrong. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to say. The woman stood up and left, leaving only the echo of those strange words. At the time, I thought she was just a confused old lady, maybe talking to someone who was no longer there. Only years later did I understand that that had been the sign I asked for, a warning I completely ignored. It's a chilling moment, isn't it? A direct warning, dismissed as confusion. We often ignore the signs that are screaming at us, especially when the truth is too monstrous to consider. Josephine is about to board that bus, unknowingly stepping out of her life and into a carefully constructed trap. Stick with us for the final leg of this fateful journey. The next morning, Penelope came by the house to pick me up. She was overly excited, talking non-stop about the shows, about how the fresh air would do me good, about how we would come back refreshed. Looking back now, it was the enthusiasm of someone who finally saw a long-cherished plan coming to fruition. Her cousin Frank was waiting at the bus station, a man in his late 30s with an unfriendly face, who barely spoke to me beyond a mumbled pleasure. I thought it was shyness, but he was just a criminal doing his dirty work. We boarded the bus to Sacramento, the first leg of the journey. From there, we would take another one to Las Vegas. Frank sat far from us, which confirmed Penelope's story that he would only accompany us to the hotel. On the way, she talked non-stop, telling stories about the city, plans for what we would do there, trying to cheer me up. I responded with weak smiles, still carrying the weight of the betrayal, the humiliation, the failure of my marriage. When we arrived in Sacramento, at the bus terminal, we had to wait almost 3 hours for the next bus. Frank disappeared, saying he had to take care of some things and would be back to board with us. Penelope suggested we go for a coffee to pass the time. It was at this cafe that she started asking strange questions. If I had told anyone besides my father about the trip, if I had left the hotel address with anyone, if Michael knew where I had gone. Of course I didn't answer, finding the questions odd. Why would I tell him? We've barely spoken since what happened. It's better this way, she said with a smile that I now recognize as sinister. The fewer people who know, the better. That way you can really rest, without anyone looking for you. When the bus to Vegas arrived, Frank reappeared, accompanied by another man who was introduced to us as a friend who was also going to Vegas. I found it strange. Penelope hadn't mentioned anyone else, but she quickly explained that it was a coincidence that they had met at the terminal. The two of them sat a few rows behind us. The bus was almost empty on that midweek trip. A few hours after we left, as it was getting dark and I was looking out the window at the lights of the farms passing by, Penelope took the thermos out of her bag. Fresh coffee. She announced as if it were the most normal thing in the world to carry coffee on a bus trip to keep us awake a little longer, to see the moonlight on the road. You always liked to see the full moon, remember? It was true. Since we were kids, we would climb onto the roof of her house on full moon nights to admire the sky. That good memory, that seemingly caring gesture of bringing coffee, how could I suspect? I accepted the cup she offered me, took a few sips. The taste was different, more bitter, with a strange aftertaste, but I attributed it to coffee made in a hurry. Maybe the water wasn't very good. Minutes later, I started to feel my tongue getting heavy, my vision blurring. "I think I'm not feeling well," I murmured, trying to focus on Penelope's face, which seemed to be multiplying in front of me. "It must be the movement of the bus," she replied, her voice sounding distant, as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. "Lean your head on my shoulder and close your eyes for a bit." The last things I remember from that night, Penelope's face transforming from a concerned friend to something cold and calculating when she thought I could no longer see properly. The man who was with Frank coming to sit near us. A whispered conversation in Spanish that my numbed brain couldn't process properly. And finally, complete darkness. When I woke up, I was in that filthy room in Las Vegas, the beginning of my 3-year hell. I want to know if this kind of evil is a thing of my time, or if it continues to happen in your modern world, where it seems everyone shows their whole lives on social media, but hides their heart. Only much later did I understand Penelope's motives. It wasn't just for the money she received. Dollars was a lot back then, but it didn't justify destroying the life of someone who grew up by your side. It was for Michael, for my house, for my life that she had always envied. The girl from the bank had just been a distraction for him. The one who had really planned to take my place was my childhood best friend, and she succeeded, as I discovered when I returned to the United States 3 years later. But that's a story for another part of the conversation. Because what happened in that brothel in Las Vegas, and how I survived to come back and face the one who betrayed me, is an even darker chapter of this story. A chapter that many people can't bear to hear until the end, but that needs to be told so that other women don't fall into the same traps I did. Because the devil, my dear, doesn't always appear with horns and a tail. Sometimes he comes with the face of a childhood friend and a smile you've known since you were 7 years old. When I woke up in that room in Las Vegas, I was so confused that for a few seconds I thought I had died and gone to hell. My head weighed a ton, my mouth so dry that my tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth, a bitter, metallic taste that wouldn't go away even when I tried to swallow the little saliva I could muster. My whole body ached, especially my back and wrists, as if I had been dragged a long way. Later I found out that's exactly what happened. They carried me like a sack of potatoes through back alleys, passing me from hand to hand like merchandise. That room, my God, I will never forget that room. It was small, maybe about 10 by 7 feet, with a small barred window so high on the wall you would need a ladder to reach it. The walls had once been white, but now they were a dirty yellow, peeling in several places, with dark stains that I preferred not to imagine what they were from. A metal bed with a thin, stained mattress took up most of the space. There was a nightstand with a basin of dirty water, a broken chair in the corner, and a bedpan under the bed. The smell was of mold, old sweat, cigarettes, and a sweet, cloying perfume that I later associated with the type of work I would be forced to do. The sounds were the first clue that I was far from home. Voices in Spanish came from the hallway, not the clean and organized Spanish from school, but a fast Spanish, with slang and expressions I didn't know. There was music playing somewhere, a repetitive and sad cumbia. From a distance, I could hear the sound of cars, horns, the typical hum of a big city, and closer, the most disturbing sound, muffled crying coming from the next room, as if someone was biting a cloth to avoid being heard. I tried to get up, but the dizziness was so strong that I fell back onto the bed. My clothes had been changed. I was no longer wearing the blue outfit I had chosen for the trip, but a thin, almost transparent nightgown that barely covered my thighs. This gave me the first shiver of real terror. Someone had undressed me while I was unconscious. Someone had touched my body without my consent, dressed me as if I were a doll. That's when I noticed that my purse, documents, money, everything was gone. Even my grandmother's necklace seemed to have been taken. I desperately ran my hands over my body, searching. With immense relief, I realized that the dress with the lining where I had hidden the necklace was folded under the mattress, as if someone had tried to hide it or discard it. I quickly pulled it out, checked the lining. The necklace was still there. The small, tight stitches had held. I gripped that little piece of rosewood so tightly that the beads marked my palm. I was still trying to sort out my thoughts when the door suddenly opened. A fat man, about 50 years old, with thinning hair and a thick mustache, entered, followed by a thin woman with a severe appearance. He looked me up and down, as if evaluating an animal at a slaughterhouse. "Ah, the American girl has awakened. Welcome to Las Vegas, my dear." He spoke with a heavy Spanish accent. "I am Walter, the owner of this establishment." Even confused, my knowledge of Spanish was enough to understand that he was introducing himself as the owner of the establishment. The woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression impenetrable. "Where am I? Who are you? Where is Penelope?" The questions came out in a jumble of English. My voice sounded strange, hoarse, as if I hadn't used it in days. Maybe that was the case. I never found out exactly how long I was unconscious. "Ah, only English, it doesn't matter." He made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Then, to my surprise, he continued in broken English, with a heavy accent. "You are in Las Vegas. This is the house of Walter, house of pretty girls like you." The shock was so great that I was speechless for a few seconds. Las Vegas. I had left Napa to go to Las Vegas. How could this be happening here? "There must be some mistake," I managed to say finally. "I was on a trip with my friend Penelope. I need to go back. My father must be worried. He's waiting for news from me." Walter exchanged a look with the woman and they both laughed. It wasn't a cheerful laugh. It was the kind of sound a predator makes when it has cornered its prey. "No mistake, American girl." He came closer, sitting heavily on the bed next to me. The mattress sank, tilting me involuntarily towards him. His breath smelled of cigarettes and something sweet. "Your friend Penelope, she sold you to me. Good price. Can you imagine that? The one person you trusted most in the world is the architect of your personal hell. This is the moment Josephine's nightmare gets a name and a price tag. Stick with us to see how she processes this ultimate betrayal. She said you have no family, that no one would look for you, said you know languages, are educated. That's why I paid a good price." The world stopped spinning for a moment. His words made no sense. They couldn't make sense. Penelope, my childhood friend, selling me like merchandise, it was too absurd to comprehend. "That's a lie," I said, my voice trembling. "Penelope is my best friend. We grew up together. She would never do that." Walter scoffed, a cruel smile on his face. "Friendship is a luxury you no longer have, American girl. Your friend sold you, and now you have a debt to me." He then continued, listing the costs as if reading from a ledger. Plus transportation expenses, false documents, bribes to the local cops. "You will work to pay off this debt. When you finish paying, maybe I'll let you go." Maybe. The reality of the situation began to form in my mind, horrible and inescapable, like a nightmare from which you can't wake up. I had been sold to a brothel in Las Vegas. I was hundreds of miles from home, without documents, without money, without anyone who knew where I was. "No," I said, getting out of bed, despite the dizziness, leaning on the wall so as not to fall. "This can't be happening. I need to go back to California. My father will pay whatever is necessary. He has a shop. He can get money." "Sit down." The order came from the woman, who had been silent until then. She took a step forward, her hand raised as if she was going to hit me. "Your father doesn't know where you are. Nobody knows. For now, You are the property of the Casa Roja. Casa Roja, the Red House, the name of the brothel, I found out later. A place known in certain circles in Las Vegas for offering exotic foreign women, most of them trafficked like me. I'm going to call the police, I threatened, trying to sound confident, despite the fear growing inside me. I'm going to the authorities. This is a crime. You can't keep me here against my will. Walter laughed again, louder this time. He stood up and went to the door. Adelina, he said to the woman, explain to our new girl how things work here. I think she hasn't understood her situation yet. He left, closing the door. I heard the sound of a key turning. I was locked in. In that moment, it wasn't just the lock on the door that turned. Something inside of me was locked away forever, too. That naive part of my soul that believed in lifelong friendship, in the goodness of people, it shattered with that cold, final click. Adelina looked at me with cold, emotionless eyes. Listen well, American girl. There is no police that will come to help you. We pay the police. There is no one that will look for you because no one knows you are here. She spoke slowly, making sure I understood every word. If you try to escape, we will break your legs. If you try to scream, we will cut your tongue. You have a debt, and you will pay it with your body. It's simple. So simple and so impossible to accept. I spent the next few days in a state of shock, alternating between crying until I had no more tears and begging anyone who appeared other women, the guards, even the cleaning ladies to help me. No one helped. Some of the other women tried to comfort me, saying that acceptance would come with time, that fighting would only make everything harder. They were women of various nationalities, Colombians, Peruvians, Paraguayans, some from Eastern Europe. All had similar stories, deceived with promises of legitimate jobs, kidnapped, sold. A week after arriving, when I was still refusing to work, I received the first lesson on the consequences of disobedience. It wasn't Walter who administered the punishment. As I found out, he rarely got his hands dirty. It was one of the security guards, a tall man with a scar that divided his face from eye to chin. He took me to a windowless room in the back. I will not describe in detail what happened there. I will only say that when they brought me back to my room, hours later, I understood that I had only two choices: obey or die. And as much as death seemed like a merciful way out, something inside me, that Californian stubbornness perhaps, refused to give up. The first client came 2 days later. I tried to dissociate, to leave my body, to pretend it was happening to someone else. It's a defense mechanism that many of us developed. I closed my eyes, mentally clutched my hidden necklace, and recited all the saints I knew, all the prayers my grandmother had taught me. When he finished, he left without a word, leaving money on the nightstand. I ran to the small communal bathroom at the end of the hall and vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach. One of the other women, Isabella, the Mexican woman I mentioned before, found me there trembling on the cold floor. She didn't say anything, just wet a cloth and wiped my face. Then she helped me back to the room. "Don't cry," she whispered. "Save your tears. You'll need them for worse things." She was right, as I discovered in the weeks and months that followed. There were worse things than that first client. There were the violent ones, the drunks, the ones who liked to hurt, the ones who asked for things that made me want to die just hearing them. And there were the punishments when we tried to resist. Beatings, isolation in the dark basement, days without food. The brothel itself was an old 3-story building, with about 20 rooms, most occupied by workers like us. The ground floor had a bar, a few tables, a small stage where we were sometimes forced to dance. It was where the clients chose who they wanted to go with. The 2 upper floors were the rooms. The basement, well, the basement was for punishments and for holding newly arrived women who were still being tamed. It wasn't the kind of place you see in movies with neon lights and women wearing expensive lingerie. It was a dirty, poorly lit place with peeling walls and a smell of mold. The clients were equally varied, from local businessmen and politicians to common workers and tourists looking for exotic adventures. The Casa Roja was not for the elite. It was for any man with enough money to pay. My knowledge of languages became my first survival mechanism. I could understand not only the Spanish of the owners and clients, but also bits of conversations in English, French, even Russian from the foreign clients. I listened to everything, absorbed information like a sponge, slowly building a mental map of the place, the routines, the people. I discovered that Walter was not the only owner. There was a partner, a former police officer named Gutierrez, who rarely appeared but was considered even more dangerous. I discovered that the Casa Roja was just one of several brothels controlled by a larger human trafficking network that operated throughout the Southwest. I found out the names of the guards, their schedules, their weaknesses. I found out which doors were left unlocked, at what times, where they kept the keys, who could be bribed, and who was ruthlessly loyal. The first escape attempt was about a month after my arrival. I had observed that one of the cleaning ladies always left a bunch of keys hanging on her cleaning cart while she worked. In a moment of distraction, I managed to grab the key that opened the back door. I waited until early morning, when the traffic was lighter and the guards were sleepier, many already drunk. I silently left the room, barefoot so as not to make any noise, and managed to reach the hallway that led to the back door. I was so close. The door was there, less than 30 feet away. I could see a sliver of light from the street coming from under it, freedom, so close I could almost taste it. I inserted the key into the lock with trembling fingers, turned it, and heard the click of the door opening. For a second, I felt a wave of euphoria so intense I almost fainted. Then, a heavy hand fell on my shoulder. "Where do you think you're going, American girl?" The voice of the scarred security guard was like ice being poured down my spine. I hadn't heard him approach. He was probably waiting, knowing about the stolen key. Maybe the cleaning lady herself had left it on purpose as a test. The punishment was 2 days in the basement, without food, without water, without light. A cubicle so small you could barely lie down, with a horrible smell of decomposition that made me wonder if others before me had died there. When they took me out, I was so weak I could barely stand. Walter was waiting. "Next time," he said, blowing cigar smoke in my face, "I'll break your legs. A woman doesn't need legs to work here. She just needs to lie down." I believed him, every word, and for a while, I gave up on the idea of escaping. I focused only on surviving one day at a time. To not completely lose my sanity, I created small routines, secrets that helped me maintain a thread of connection with who I had been before. Every morning when I woke up, I would quietly recite the names of all the streets in Napa I could remember. Every night before I slept, I would hold my hidden necklace and pray not only to be saved, but to keep my humanity intact. Over time, we formed a sort of makeshift family among the women. Not all of us. Some were too broken by the system. Some became informants for the owners to gain small privileges. But others, like Isabella, the Mexican, and Sofia, a Paraguayan who had been a teacher before being kidnapped, became like sisters. We would trade food when one was being punished with food restriction. We took care of each other's wounds after violent clients or beatings from the guards. We whispered stories of our past lives in the rare hours of rest, promising that one day we would go home. Many never did. I saw women die there from untreated illnesses, from beatings that went too far, from forced or chosen overdoses as the only way out. I saw new girls arrive, crying and begging as I had done, and then watch them slowly lose hope, their eyes dimming day by day, until they became empty shells. Those who say that hell is after death have never seen what one human being can do to another in life. The second escape attempt was almost a year later, more elaborate, more carefully planned. Me, Isabella, and Sofia had managed, over months, to accumulate small pieces of jewelry that some clients gave us as gifts. Cheap rings, bracelets, earrings. We put it all together and managed to bribe one of the new guards, a young man who seemed less brutal than the others. He promised to leave the back door open on a specific night and look the other way. We planned every detail for weeks. We memorized the way to the nearest police station, which we had found out was about 20 blocks away. We managed to hide some normal clothes so as not to attract attention on the street, wearing the provocative clothes from the brothel. We even made a small map of the city with information we could extract from conversations with clients. On the agreed night, we silently went down the service stairs, our hearts beating so loud it felt like they could be heard. The door was open, as promised. We stepped out onto the street, the cool night air of Las Vegas, the first time I felt the free wind on my face in almost a year. We took a few steps on the dark street, and then lights came on. Men appeared from all sides. The guard had betrayed us, telling Walter the plan in exchange for more money. The punishment this time was the worst I have ever experienced in my life. I was separated from the others, taken to a room in the back that I didn't even know existed. I spent 2 weeks there, being disciplined. I can't and don't want to describe everything that happened in that room. When they finally took me back to the room I shared with other women, even Isabella didn't recognize me at first. I had lost almost 30 pounds. My face was deformed by bruises. 2 fingers on my left hand had been broken with pliers and never straightened out again. But the worst part wasn't the visible marks. It was what they did to my soul. For a while after that, I believed I had died in that room, and what was left was just an empty shell. People talk about the will to survive, don't they? But sometimes, the body keeps on living long after the soul has surrendered. I wasn't fighting anymore then. I was simply existing, a ghost breathing inside my own skin, just waiting for the end. This is what it sounds like when a soul shatters. They've taken everything from her freedom, her body, and now, her will to even exist. But the story isn't over. Sometimes, when you are at your absolute lowest, a lifeline appears where you least expect it. Don't go anywhere, because the arrival of one man is about to change the course of Josephine's fate. I didn't speak, I didn't react, I just existed. The clients still came, I still worked, but it was as if I was observing everything from a great distance, as if that body no longer belonged to me. It was in this darkest period that I met David, the American merchant who would change my life. He regularly visited Las Vegas on business, importing goods for stores in the United States. He became a frequent client, always asking for me. At first, I hated him like all the others, but gradually, I noticed something different. He treated me with a minimum of kindness, nothing extraordinary for the normal world. But in the hell where I lived, it was like water in the desert. He was never violent. He always asked if he was hurting me. Sometimes, he would just pay for the hours to talk in English. He said he missed his mother tongue. He brought small gifts, not jewelry or lingerie like other clients, but things like a chocolate bar, a book in English, once even a small bottle of perfume that reminded me of the smell of jasmine that grew in the backyard of my house in Napa. It took me months to trust him enough to tell him my story. I was afraid it was a trap, another test by Walter to see if I still thought about escaping. But something in David's eyes, a genuine kindness, a sadness when he looked at the conditions of the place made me take a risk. One night, after he had brought a small box of American sweets that made me cry with homesickness, I told him everything. Who I was, how I had been deceived by Penelope, how I had ended up there. I saw something change in his eyes, a mixture of horror and compassion that seemed genuine. "I'm going to help you," he whispered, so low I could barely hear. "I can't do anything directly or they'll get suspicious, but I have a plan. I need you to trust me." Trust was something I no longer knew how to do, but what choice did I have? 2 escape attempts had failed miserably. I was getting weaker physically and emotionally. I realized that, like many others, I would not survive a few more years in those conditions. David's plan was risky, but simple. He traveled regularly between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, carrying packages, product samples. On his next trip, he would take a small package to an address in the United States, a small box of local crafts that he would buy right there in Las Vegas. Inside this box, he would hide a message from me with all the details of the brothel, my full name, where I was from, Penelope's name, everything. The address would be the FBI in Los Angeles. "I can't carry the message openly," he explained. "If they catch me with this, not only will you die, but I will too. I have a family, children, but I can deliver this package without raising suspicion. It's the most I can do." It was a slim chance, a thread of hope so thin you could barely see it, but it was something. I spent days thinking about how to write the message. It had to be small enough to hide, but contain all the necessary information. David discreetly brought me a piece of paper and a small pencil hidden in the lining of a book. I wrote the message on a tiny piece of paper with letters so small it hurt my eyes to read. I included my full name, date of birth, last known address in the United States. I described in detail the location of the Casa Roja, the names of the owners and guards I knew, the approximate number of women held there, their nationalities. I mentioned the connection to other brothels, the little I knew about the larger trafficking network, and crucially, I included Penelope's full name, her address in Napa, and how she had sold me. David got a small, typical Nevada souvenir wooden statuette, the kind sold to tourists. He made a false bottom in it, where we hid the message. It was delicate work. If someone examined it carefully, they might notice, but it was our only chance. I handed him the statuette one night, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. "It will work," he promised. "Have faith." Faith was the only thing I had left, clinging to that hidden necklace that had become my only connection to my previous life. The following weeks were the longest of my life. Every noise at the door made me jump, imagining the police arriving, or worse, Walter, discovering what we had done. David had said he would be back in a month, but a month passed and nothing. Then 2. I started to think I had been deceived again, that David had simply left and forgotten, or that he never intended to help. Hope is a cruel thing. It hurts more to lose it a second time. I learned later that the investigation had been complicated. The FBI needed to coordinate with the Las Vegas Police Department, which involved bureaucracy and jurisdictional issues. Furthermore, the trafficking network had political connections, protection from powerful people. It wasn't just a matter of raiding the place. They needed to build a solid case, identify all those involved, plan an operation that would catch not only that brothel, but others linked to the same network. Meanwhile, life at the Casa Roja continued its horrible usual rhythm. Clients came and went. Women got sick, some died, new ones arrived. I continued to exist in a state of suspension, not completely alive, not dead, just waiting, without even knowing what I was waiting for anymore. Then, one early morning that seemed just like all the others, I woke up to the sound of doors being broken down, screams, gunshots. My first thought was that it was a fight between rival gangs, something that happened sometimes in the area. But then I heard something I hadn't heard in almost 3 years. Voices speaking English with an American accent. "FBI, everyone on the ground." The rescue had finally arrived. The message had been delivered. David had kept his promise. The operation was quick and efficient. The Casa Roja was surrounded, the owners and guards arrested, the women rescued. I learned later that it wasn't just that brothel. On that same day, simultaneous operations took place in 5 different cities in Nevada, Arizona, and California, dismantling a network that had been operating for over a decade trafficking women. We were all taken to a safe shelter, where we received medical care, clothes, decent food for the first time in years. There were psychologists, social workers, people from the State Department, an FBI agent, a woman in her 40s with kind but determined eyes, explained to me that my message had been the missing piece to connect several cases that were already being investigated. "You saved not only yourself, but dozens of other women," she said, holding my hand in hers. "Your testimony will be crucial to convict not only the owners of this place, but much more powerful people involved in the scheme." 2 weeks after the rescue, I returned to California on a U.S. Air Force plane, along with 5 other American women rescued in the same operation. The journey was silent, each one lost in her own thoughts, in her own versions of the hell we had lived and survived. When the plane landed on Californian soil, I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. I was home. Finally home. But you see, you can leave hell, but hell never truly leaves you. Those tears weren't just for my freedom. They were for the 2-3-year-old girl who stepped onto that fateful bus and never got to come back. I was home finally, or at least back in the state that had once been my home. But the return home was not the happy ending I had imagined during the long nights in captivity. Because while I was fighting to survive in a Las Vegas brothel, life in Napa had gone on. And what I discovered when I returned was as painful as the years of captivity. Maybe even more so because it came from whom I least expected. And maybe, just maybe, some Josephine out there will escape the fate that almost destroyed me. The worst was yet to come when I arrived in Napa, because Penelope's betrayal went far beyond selling me to traffickers. During the 3 years I was missing, she had not only married Michael, my ex-husband, but had also taken over my house, my belongings, even my identity, as if she had not only sold me, but had literally tried to take my place in the life I had left behind. But that part of the story, what I found when I returned and how I finally got justice, is an even more surprising chapter in this saga. A chapter that shows that sometimes justice is slow, but it comes, even at the hands of those we least expect. The journey back to the United States was like waking up from a nightmare, only to find that reality wasn't much better. On that U.S. Air Force plane, with 5 other American women rescued in the same operation, I had plenty of time to think about what lay ahead. We were all silent, each one embracing her own pain, her own stories. I looked out the window, watching the clouds pass below, thinking about my family, my home, the simple things I had dreamed of during those 3 years. Breakfast in the kitchen at home, the sound of rain on the roof in Napa, the smell of wet earth in the backyard. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., I was met by a team from the FBI, not as a suspect, but as a key witness in a case that, without my knowing, had become one of the biggest human trafficking scandals in the Southwest. Detective Sarah Morgan, a woman of about 45, with eyes that seemed to read your soul, was the one who received me. Mrs. Thompson, she said, shaking my hand firmly but gently. I can't imagine what you've been through these years, but I want you to know that your courage saved not only you, but dozens of other women, and will help save many more. I was housed for 2 weeks in a protected location in D.C., a kind of safe house for protected witnesses. There, I underwent complete medical examinations, psychological counseling, and detailed interviews with the police. I also began the process of recovering my legal identity. After all, I had been missing for 3 years, without documents, without records, like a ghost. It was during these interviews that I discovered the extent of what had happened. David, the American merchant who had helped me, delivered my message hidden in the statuette, not directly to the police, as I thought, but to an investigative journalist who was already looking into cases of missing women in the region. The journalist, in turn, took the information to the FBI, which already had an ongoing investigation into a large domestic human trafficking network operating between California, Nevada, and Arizona. Your message was the missing piece, explained Detective Morgan. You gave names, addresses, specific details that allowed us to connect cases that seemed isolated. It was like turning on the light in a dark room. Suddenly, we saw how everything was connected. The operation that rescued me was named Operation Violet, a strange coincidence, since that was my mother's name. It wasn't just the Casa Roja that was shut down that day. Simultaneously, law enforcement in 3 states raided brothels, arrested traffickers, and rescued women in situations similar to mine. More than 80 women were freed, some who had been in captivity for over 5 years. But while the world celebrated the success of the operation, I was preparing to face my own private hell, to return to Napa, to find out what had happened to my family, to my life during those 3 years. Detective Morgan tried to warn me, to prepare me for the shock. Josephine, she said on the eve of my departure, we investigated the involvement of Penelope Fernandez in your case. We discovered things that will be hard to hear. Do you want me to tell you now, or would you rather find out when you get there? Now, I replied, feeling a knot in my stomach. I need to prepare for what I'm going to face. She hesitated, then spoke in a calm but direct voice. Penelope married your ex-husband, Michael, approximately 6 months after your disappearance. They are living in your house in Napa. She took over your life, so to speak. She wears your clothes, your belongings. She works at your father's shop, who passed away a year ago, believing that his daughter had run away after discovering her husband's affair. She escaped one prison only to find herself in another, built of grief and an even deeper betrayal. Penelope didn't just sell her, she erased her. Don't go anywhere, because the confrontation you've been waiting for is about to happen. The world stopped spinning for a moment. My father dead, without knowing what had really happened to me. And Penelope had not only sold me like cattle, but had taken over my life, as if I were just a character she could replace, a vacant role she could assume. Furthermore, Morgan continued, we have strong evidence that this was not the first time she has done this. We found records of at least 2 other women from neighboring towns who disappeared under similar circumstances in the last 10 years. Women with whom Penelope had some kind of connection and whose disappearance somehow benefited her. I didn't cry. I had used up all my tears in those 3 years in Las Vegas. What I felt was a cold determination, as if something inside me had hardened into stone. When can I go back to Napa? We are arranging your return in 2 days, but you need to understand something important. You will be under police protection, not only because you are a witness in a federal case, but because Penelope can be dangerous. She knows you were found, that you are coming back, and people like her, when they feel cornered, can do desperate things. The next day, I received a visit from a federal prosecutor who explained the legal aspects of the situation. My house, technically, was still mine. There had never been an estate process, since officially I was missing, not dead. My rights to my father's inheritance were also preserved, as my presumed death had not been declared. But recovering all of this would take time, legal proceedings. The most important thing now, explained the prosecutor, is to gather evidence against Penelope for the crime of human trafficking. Your testimony is essential, but material evidence would make all the difference. The next day, I boarded a flight to Sacramento, accompanied by 2 federal agents. From there, we drove to Napa. The 3-hour drive on the winding road through the California mountains gave me time to absorb the impact of returning home after everything. Every curve in the road brought back memories. Trips with my father to buy supplies in Sacramento. The first time Michael took me to meet his family in Fresno. School trips to the Railroad Museum. Napa appeared on the horizon like an old painting, the colonial houses, the historic churches, the stone streets. But for me, it was like looking at a faded photograph of a place that no longer existed. The town was the same, but I was a different person. And as I would soon discover, the people I knew had also changed. We didn't go directly to my old house. The federal agents took me to a motel on the outskirts of town, where we would stay during the operation. On the way, I passed by the town square, by street, Anthony's church, where I had gotten married, by the street where my father's shop was. Everything the same, and everything different. I need to visit the cemetery, I told the agents. I need to see where my father is buried. They agreed. In the small municipal cemetery, we found the simple grave, a marble headstone with the words, George Thompson, 1920 to 1970, beloved father and honored merchant. And below, an inscription that made my heart stop. Awaiting reunion with his daughter Josephine. I knelt on the damp earth, the first tears since the rescue finally finding their way. Forgive me, Dad, I whispered. Forgive me for not being here. Back at the motel, the federal agents explained the plan for the next few days. First, a discreet reconnaissance of the house and the shop to understand Penelope's and Michael's routine. Then, the official approach with a court order to enter the property and collect evidence. And only then, the confrontation. You will not be alone at any moment, Agent Marcos assured me. We will not let you run any risk. That night was long. Lying in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, I relived every moment of the last few years. The scenes of horror at the Casa Roja mixed with childhood memories in Napa, with the pain of my father's absence, with the anger that grew as I thought of Penelope living my life while I survived in hell. The next morning, the agents took me in a car with tinted windows for a discreet patrol through the center of town. We passed by my old house, the little house with blue windows, and a backyard with an apple tree. I saw clothes on the line, a chair on the porch, signs that it was inhabited. Something twisted inside my chest at the thought of Penelope sleeping in my room, using my belongings, living the life she stole from me. We also passed by the winery that had been my father's. The facade had been renovated. A new sign announced Fernandez Wines since 1970. Her name, not ours, as if my family's history had been erased and rewritten. And it was there, stopped in front of the shop inside the car, that I saw her for the first time in 3 years. Penelope came out to serve a customer, smiling that smile I had known since childhood. She was thinner, her hair shorter, but the same bright green eyes. She was wearing a necklace I recognized immediately. It had belonged to my mother, one of the few pieces of jewelry left after she died. The impulse to get out of the car, to confront her right there, was almost irresistible. For 3 years, I had pictured her face in my darkest nightmares. But seeing her there, smiling in the sunlight, wearing my mother's necklace, it wasn't anger I felt at first. It was a profound violation, as if she hadn't just stolen my life, but was now wearing my very soul as a trophy. My whole body trembled with the effort to contain myself. Agent Marcos must have noticed, because he placed his hand on my shoulder. "Not yet," he said calmly. "We have to do this the right way." Back at the motel, I met the rest of the team that had come for the operation. 3 more federal agents and a prosecutor specializing in human trafficking. The plan was set. The next day, with a court order in hand, they would enter my old house when Michael was at work, leaving Penelope alone. The night was sleepless, thoughts racing like wild horses. What would I say when I saw her? How would I react upon entering the house that was once mine? What evidence would we find? And most importantly, would I get justice after everything? The next morning, at 9 o'clock, 2 FBI cars stopped in front of my old house. The operation began. I stayed in the second car with my heart pounding so hard, I thought it would explode. I saw the agents knock on the door, Penelope answering, the shock on her face when she saw the badges. I saw her retreat inside, the officers entering. Then Agent Marcos signaled for me to get out of the car. It was time for the confrontation. Entering that house was like stepping back in time. The same furniture, the same curtains I had chosen, the same paintings on the walls. But there were different things. Also photos of Penelope and Michael, where ours used to be, objects I didn't recognize, a different smell in the air. Penelope was sitting on the living room sofa, surrounded by agents. When she saw me, her face lost all color. It was as if she were seeing a ghost, which, in a way, I was. The ghost of the woman she had tried to replace, whom she had sold to die far away. "Josephine," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "You're alive." "Despite your efforts," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "Despite you selling me to a brothel in Las Vegas to die far from home while you stole my life." She began to deny it. Of course. The story she told the police was that I had run away after discovering Michael's affair, that no one knew where I had gone, that she and Michael had grown closer in the process of looking for me. But the agents were already searching the house, and it didn't take long to find the first piece of physical evidence. Hidden in the back of a drawer in the bedroom was a notebook with notes of names, dates, values, a kind of macabre accounting of human trafficking. In it, my name appeared with the value of $1,000 next to it, with the notation Vegas W, the initials of Walter Ramirez, owner of the Casa Roja. Penelope broke down. There it is, in cold, hard ink, the proof of an unspeakable crime. For Josephine, this isn't just evidence. It's the validation of her entire ordeal. The mask is off, and the fight for justice is just beginning. She started to cry, to tremble, to say that she had been forced, that she didn't know what they were doing to me, that she had been threatened. Lies, one after another, desperate and incoherent. "Enough," said the prosecutor, interrupting. "Miss Penelope Fernandez, you are being arrested for the crime of human trafficking based on the evidence found in this residence and the victim's testimony. You have the right to remain silent." While she read her rights, I looked around the room, at that space that had once been my home. Now it was just the scene of a crime, a place contaminated by lies and betrayal. I couldn't imagine living there again, maybe never. Justice was served, that's what they said. But justice can't give you back the years you lost, and it can't wash the memory of betrayal from these walls. This house wasn't a home anymore. It was just a crime scene, and my life was the victim. The agents arrested Penelope and took her away. I stayed in the house with the prosecutor and one of the agents, identifying what was mine, what she had brought. It was a painful process, like sifting through the broken pieces of a life that no longer existed. In what had been my room, I found hidden in the back of the wardrobe a box with my most personal things, letters from my mother, childhood photos, my grandmother's wedding ring, things of no financial value, but of inestimable emotional value. Why had Penelope kept that instead of just throwing it away? It was as if she wanted not only my life, but my memories, my history. Michael was arrested at his law office that same afternoon. His reaction, upon seeing me, was one of absolute shock, as if he were facing a specter. Unlike Penelope, he didn't have time to try to create a story. The evidence found at the house, especially a bank transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands, for the exact amount of $1,000 made days after my disappearance, directly incriminated him. Later, during interrogations, the full story emerged, each detail more disturbing than the last. The affair I discovered, Michael with the girl from the bank, had not been accidental. It was planned by him and Penelope to weaken me emotionally, to make me vulnerable to her manipulation. The trip to Las Vegas was never in the plans. It was just the excuse to get me to a place where I'd be isolated and where it would be easier to hand me over to the traffickers. The whole plan had been orchestrated for months. Penelope, driven by a sick envy she had carried since childhood, wanted my life, my husband, my house, even my father's shop. Michael, in turn, had serious financial problems due to gambling, debts that left him vulnerable to proposals like the one he received from the traffickers, $1,000 for quality merchandise. A young, educated woman who spoke languages. In the days that followed, other macabre discoveries came to light. Penelope was not only involved in my case, she had connections to a trafficking network that operated throughout the region, identifying vulnerable women in small towns in rural California. Women who, for some reason, had few family connections, few friends, easy targets who would take a long time to be missed. Detective Morgan, who came from Washington, D.C., especially to oversee the arrests, explained that this type of trafficking was more common than imagined. It's not always the stranger offering a job abroad, the classic scam we see in awareness campaigns, she said. Often it's people who are close, trusted, who take advantage of moments of vulnerability. With Penelope and Michael arrested and the investigation underway, I suddenly found myself adrift. The house that had been mine was cordoned off as a crime scene. My father's shop, which by right would be my inheritance, was under investigation. I had no money, no documents, no clothes, nothing beyond what the FBI had provided me at the shelter in D.C. That's when I received an unexpected phone call. A distant cousin, Beatrice, who lived in Sacramento, had seen the news about my rescue in the newspaper. "Josephine, my dear," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Come stay with me for as long as you need." Beatrice was the daughter of my father's uncle, about 15 years older than me. She had moved to Sacramento when she was young to study nursing and rarely returned to Napa. We only saw each other on special occasions, a wedding here, a funeral there, but at that moment, she was the only hand extended in my direction. With the help of the federal agents who took care of my security until Sacramento, I went to Beatrice's house, a simple but cozy apartment in the Midtown neighborhood. "You can stay as long as you need," she said, hugging me at the door. "We're in this together." The months that followed were of slow and painful reconstruction. Physically, because my body still carried the marks of the 3 years of captivity and abuse, visible scars, chronic pain, the 2 fingers of my left hand that never straightened out again. And emotionally, because the trauma of those years was not something you could leave behind simply by returning home. Beatrice helped me find a psychologist specializing in severe trauma. Dr. Emily Carter, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, accompanied me for years in this process. "Trauma is not like a cold that goes away with time," she explained. "It's more like learning to live with a scar. It never completely disappears, but it can become part of your story without defining who you are." Gradually, I recovered my legal identity. New documents, opening a bank account, social security card, voter registration, small steps that gave me back my official existence in the world. I also began the process of recovering my inheritance, my father's winery, which Penelope had illegally registered in her name after his death. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Penelope, Michael, and the others involved in the trafficking scheme continued. My testimony was taken several times, each time more detailed, to build a solid case. The notebook found in my old house proved to be a goldmine of evidence. It contained not only my name, but those of 6 other women trafficked over the years, with dates, values, and destinations. It was through this notebook that we began to find other victims. Some, like me, had managed to survive and escape. Others were never found. And some, we discovered with horror, had died in captivity, confirming what I already knew from my experiences at the Casa Roja. A year after my rescue, I received a call from Detective Morgan. "Josephine, we found Jessica Riley," she said with a note of triumph in her voice. Jessica Riley was one of the women listed in Penelope's notebook, missing from Bakersfield, 5 years before me. She had been sold to a brothel in Asunción, Paraguay. "Is she alive?" I asked, barely daring to hope. "Alive. And on her way home," Morgan confirmed, and willing to testify. Jessica became my ally in that fight for justice. We met in person during a preparatory hearing for the trial. She had been an elementary school teacher. She was 2 years younger than me, with a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had also been sold by someone close, in her case, a cousin who coveted her small inheritance. "When I heard that you had managed to come back, that you had helped dismantle the network, I felt something I hadn't felt in years," she told me, holding my hands in hers. Hope. The trial of Penelope and Michael began 2 years after my rescue. It was one of the first cases tried under the new American legislation on human trafficking, which had stricter penalties and clearer definitions of the crime. The prosecution built an impressive case, connecting the dots between my case, Jessica's, and other victims, exposing the entire network that operated in the shadows. The day I entered the courtroom to testify was one of the most difficult of my life. I would have to relive every detail of that horror, looking at the faces of the people who had caused me so much suffering. Penelope and Michael were there, sitting side by side, both looking haggard after 2 years of pretrial detention. She had lost weight, her once shiny hair now lifeless. He had gained wrinkles that weren't there before, his empty eyes avoiding mine. As I walked to the witness stand, I felt the weight of all the eyes in the room on me. Journalists, victims' families, curious onlookers. The case had received national attention, one of the biggest human trafficking scandals involving middle-class people, breaking the stereotype that this only happened to poor women or those on the streets. For 4 hours, I answered questions from the prosecution and the defense. I told every detail I could remember, from my childhood friendship with Penelope, the signs I ignored, to the moment I was drugged on the bus, waking up in the brothel in Las Vegas, the 3 years of captivity. I talked about the escape attempts, about the punishments, about the other women I met there, some who died, others who lost their sanity. I talked about David and the plan of the hidden message, about the rescue, about what I found when I returned to Napa. Penelope's defense tried everything. To claim that she was also a victim, that she had been coerced, that she didn't know where I was really going. But the evidence was overwhelming. The notebook with meticulous notes, the testimonies of other victims, the bank records, showing transfers to accounts linked to the traffickers, and, most importantly, the testimony of one of the men arrested in the operation in Nevada, who, in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirmed that Penelope was a frequent contact, a reliable recruiter. The most intense moment of the trial was when the judge allowed me to ask a question directly to Penelope. I looked into her eyes, those green eyes I had known since childhood, and asked, "Why? We grew up together, we shared secrets, dreams. I trusted you. What did I do to deserve this?" For the first time, I saw something beyond the mask of innocence she had worn until then. I saw a glimpse of what was really inside her, a dark well of envy and resentment. "You had everything," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "You always had intelligence, talent, beauty. Your father adored you. Everyone liked you more. It was always Josephine this, Josephine that, and I was always just Josephine's friend. And there's the truth, uglier and smaller than any monster you could imagine. A lifetime of friendship destroyed by the quiet poison of envy. This confession seals Penelope's fate, but it opens up a whole new set of questions for Josephine, and there it was. After all the pain, all the suffering, the reason for my hell wasn't some grand evil plan. It was something small and rotten, like a worm in an apple. The simple, quiet poison of envy, which had been growing in the shadows of our friendship my whole life. She swallowed hard. When I met Michael, for the first time I felt I could have something you had. Something that was just mine. But he chose you, like everyone always did. It was a raw, disturbing confession in its honesty. It was not the answer of someone who regretted, but of someone who was finally showing their true face. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, the verdict. Penelope was sentenced to 22 years in prison for human trafficking, criminal association, document forgery, and other related crimes. Michael received a sentence of 18 years. Others involved in the scheme, the fake cousin Frank, some corrupt police officers who facilitated their operations, also received heavy sentences. When I left the courthouse that last day, I felt something strange. Not exactly relief or happiness, but a kind of closure, a terrible chapter of my life that was finally coming to an end. But another was just beginning. In the years that followed, I dedicated my life to 2 things: rebuilding my own existence and helping other victims of human trafficking. With the sale of my father's winery, which I finally recovered after a long legal battle, I had the resources to start over. I didn't want to go back to live in Napa. Too many memories, too many looks, too many whispers. I preferred to stay in Sacramento, close to Beatrice, who became the family I had lost. I started studying law at 45, probably the oldest student in the class, certainly the one with the most stories to tell. I wanted to understand the system that had failed me and so many other women, but I also wanted the tools to change it. When I graduated 5 years later, I specialized in human rights and human trafficking. At the same time, I founded a support group with Jessica and other survivors for women rescued from trafficking. It wasn't a formal NGO. It had no funding or office. It was just a safe space where we could share our experiences, support each other in rebuilding, serve as living testimony that it was possible to survive and move forward. Life was never the same again. Of course, I still carry the scars of those years, physical and emotional. I have frequent nightmares. I startle at sudden noises. I have difficulty trusting new people. The formal diagnosis came years later: PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But with constant therapy, medication when necessary, and a solid support network, I learned to manage the symptoms, not to let them define who I am. I never married again, nor had children. That dream was lost somewhere between Napa and Las Vegas. But I found other forms of connection, other ways to build a family. Beatrice, with whom I shared an apartment for years, until she passed away in 2015. Jessica, who became more than a friend, a sister chosen by the cruel fate we shared and overcame. The women from the support group, each with her unique story of horror and resistance. When I look back at that 2-3-year-old young woman, who I once was, naive and confident, I feel a mixture of affection and sadness. I wish I could go back and warn her about the dangers hidden behind familiar smiles. But I also know that that naivety was part of what made me human, what made me alive. What did I learn along this journey? That evil can come dressed as friendship, but also that our strength comes from within, that there is not just one type of survival. Sometimes surviving is simply breathing until the next day. Other times it is fighting tooth and nail. And sometimes it is learning to rebuild life with the broken pieces that are left. Do you think I was wrong to dedicate 10 years of my life seeking justice instead of simply trying to forget and move on? What would you have done in my place if you discovered that your best friend destroyed your life out of envy? Because many people questioned me, you know? Distant relatives, acquaintances, even some mental health professionals. Why don't you leave that behind? They would ask. Why cling to the past instead of focusing on the future? I never knew how to answer properly. I only knew that I needed to see justice done, not just for me, but for all the others who had no voice, who couldn't come back to tell their story. And in the process, I discovered that justice is not just punishment for those who did wrong, it is also the recovery of one's own dignity, one's own history. When the trial ended and the sentences were given, I thought I could finally turn the page, leave it all behind, but life has its own twists and turns, its own plans for us. Because 5 years later, when I thought this chapter was definitively closed, I received a letter from prison, a letter from Penelope. And what was written in that letter would once again change the course of my life. But that part of the story, what happened after I read those pages written by the hand of the woman who had destroyed my life and how it led me to a final confrontation, I never imagined possible. Well, that's a separate chapter. A chapter about forgiveness, redemption, and the true meaning of freedom. That letter from Penelope, received 5 years after the trial, turned my world upside down again. Yellowed paper, trembling letters, words I never imagined reading from the woman who had been the beginning and almost the end of my story. "Josephine," she wrote, "I'm dying. Terminal cancer. I have a few months. Before I go, I need to tell you something that might change everything you think about me, about Michael, about what happened. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to read until the end, please. Evil is never simple, is it? I thought I knew the whole story, that Penelope was the only snake in my garden. But the truth, much like venom, often has more layers than you think. And it's the final layer that truly poisons the soul." I almost tore up the letter without finishing. I almost threw it in the trash along with the memories I fought so hard to overcome. But that curiosity that has always been my strength and my weakness made me keep reading. What Penelope revealed in those 5 pages was even more disturbing than anything I already knew. It hadn't been her who orchestrated the original plan. It had been Michael. Just when you think you know who the villain is, the story twists one last time. This final revelation doesn't excuse Penelope, but it shows how evil can be a chain reaction, ensnaring everyone it touches. Stay with us for the final, emotional conclusion to Josephine's story. He was up to his neck in gambling debts, owing dangerous people. One of these creditors had connections to human trafficking and made the proposal. In exchange for forgiving the debt, he wanted an American woman for a brothel in Nevada. Michael thought of me immediately. Penelope, with whom he was already having an affair for months, even before I discovered the affair with the girl from the bank, which was just a distraction to destabilize me, initially hesitated, but her own resentment that she had carried since childhood, the sick envy she felt for me, ended up overcoming any moral scruples she still had. "After you disappeared," the letter continued, "Michael received the debt forgiveness as agreed. We got married quickly, took over your house, your father's shop when he died, but the life I imagined never existed. Michael treated me like trash, beat me when he drank, cheated on me with anyone. It was as if, without you to torment, he needed someone else to take out his own misery on. Fate has these perverse ironies. The woman who sold me out of envy ended up living a hell similar to the one she condemned me to, only in freedom." At one point in the letter, she wrote, "Sometimes I think you were luckier than me. At least you knew who your enemies were while I slept with mine." The last lines were almost illegible, the handwriting weak from someone who could barely hold a pen. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that in my last days I understood the evil I did, and that if I could go back, I would have been the friend you deserved, not the monster I became." I spent days thinking about that letter, digesting that final truth. I ended up visiting Penelope in prison, where she was serving her sentence. She was unrecognizable, thin, pale, her once proud hair now thin and lifeless. The cancer had spread throughout her body. We didn't exchange many words during that visit. What was there to say had already been written. I just held her hand while she cried. I didn't forgive her. Some things are beyond forgiveness. But holding that frail hand, I realized a bitter truth. The greatest demon wasn't Penelope herself, but the envy and weakness that live inside people. And sometimes, the jailer is also a prisoner, trapped by their own terrible choices. Silent tears of a woman who finally saw the dimension of her own evil. It wasn't forgiveness I offered. Some things are beyond forgiveness, but perhaps a kind of peace, for her, for me. Penelope died 2 weeks later. I was the only one present at the funeral, besides the prison chaplain. I didn't cry. I just stood there, looking at the simple coffin, being lowered into the earth, thinking about how our lives had intertwined in ways that neither of us could have imagined when we were just 2 girls sharing cookies on the first day of school. It was in that cemetery, under a light rain, typical of California, that I finally felt something release inside me. A knot I had carried for so many years, since that first morning, waking up disoriented at the Casa Roja. It wasn't forgiveness for Penelope. It was forgiveness for myself, for having trusted blindly, for not having seen the signs, for having blamed myself for years for something that was never my fault. With this unexpected closure, I could really start to build a new life. In my early 50 seconds, after graduating from law school, I decided it was time to leave Sacramento and seek new horizons. I didn't go back to Napa. The memories were still too heavy. Instead, I moved to a neighboring town, Sonoma, smaller, quieter, with that same colonial charm I knew well, but without the ghosts that haunted me. I sold the old house in Napa. I could never live there again. With the money, I bought a simple but cozy little house in Sonoma, with a porch that overlooked the mountains. I set up a small office at home where I handled cases related to human rights, especially women in situations of violence. I didn't charge these women. The money from the sale of my father's winery, invested over the years, gave me enough comfort to live without financial worries. The work with other victims started informally, almost by accident. A woman sought me out after reading about my case in an old newspaper. She had gone through something similar, not international trafficking, but private imprisonment for years at the hands of her own husband. She didn't know who to turn to, how to rebuild her life. I just listened to her. I shared my own experience, gave some practical advice. Soon, this woman brought another, then another, and another. Without planning it, I found myself at the center of an informal support network for women survivors of violence. We didn't have a headquarters, no tax ID, no official funding. It was just a group that met regularly on my porch, drinking coffee, sharing stories, offering shoulders to cry on and hands to lift up. Jessica, my companion in misfortune, and then in struggle, joined me in this endeavor. Together, we created what we affectionately called the Survivors Circle, a safe space where women who had lived through the worst of humanity could find understanding without judgment, support without pity, strength to rebuild their lives. We were not therapists, although we had a network of mental health professionals who volunteered when needed. We were not social workers, although we knew all the bureaucratic paths to access rights and benefits. We were something simpler and perhaps more fundamental. Women who had walked through the valley of the shadow and returned to extend a hand to others who were still lost in the darkness. Over time, our small circle gained informal recognition in the region. Judges, detectives, social workers began to refer cases to us. We couldn't help everyone. Our resources were limited, our own energies finite, but for those we could reach, we made a difference. One of the greatest joys of this phase of my life was seeing the transformation of these women. Like Joanna, who came to us unable to look anyone in the eye after 15 years of abuse and years later became a teacher, helping others find their voice. Or Teresa, who had been held captive for 7 years by a boyfriend she met online and who later graduated with a degree in psychology specializing in trauma. Or even Marina, trafficked like me, who managed to open a small craft business and now exclusively employs women in vulnerable situations. Each story of a new beginning was like medicine for my own wounds. Every woman who managed to rebuild her life showed me that I also had the right to my own reconstruction, my own happiness. And I found joy, yes, small at first, like being able to walk alone without fear, to sleep a whole night without nightmares, to savor a meal without that constant anxiety that was my companion for so long. Then greater joys, true friendships, a sense of purpose, moments of unexpected beauty. I never married again. It's true. The trauma of the years of captivity left deep marks on how I relate to physical intimacy. I tried a few times with kind and patient men, but there always came a moment when the past came back like a tsunami, washing away any possibility of true connection. But that didn't mean a life without love. I developed deep connections with friends who became chosen family. Jessica, until her death in 2017, was more than a friend. She was a sister, confidant, partner in battle. The women of our circle, those who stayed for years, became extensions of my family. And then, at 65, I met Charles, a retired university professor, a widower for 10 years, with kind eyes that had seen enough of life not to judge scars. We met at a human rights lecture I gave at UC Berkeley. He came to ask me questions, then invited me for coffee. At first it was just a friendship, conversations about books, politics, philosophy. Over time, it became something more, although different from what people normally call romance. We never lived together. There was no formal marriage, but we saw each other almost every day, took care of each other, shared joys and sorrows. It was a relationship based on deep respect, on mutual understanding of each other's limits and possibilities. Charles understood my silences, my moments of seclusion, my inability for certain types of intimacy, and I understood his devotion to the memory of his deceased wife, his love for his children and grandchildren, his need for space for his own intellectual passions. It was an autumn love, serene and deep, as it can only be when we have already passed through the fires of youth and learned the value of gentle warmth that does not burn, but only warms. Charles passed away 3 years ago after a massive stroke. Another loss, another pain, but this time a clean pain, without the poison of betrayal, without the horror of trauma, just the natural sadness of losing someone dear, of saying goodbye to a gentle soul. Now, at 79, I live alone in this house in Sonoma. I am no longer on the front lines of work with victims. Age takes its toll, and new, younger women have taken on that responsibility. But I continue as a kind of counselor, a voice of experience that is called upon when cases are particularly difficult. My days have a peaceful rhythm. I wake up early with the sun rising behind the mountains. I have my coffee on the porch, watching the hummingbirds in the garden. I read a lot. I've always been a devourer of books. And now I have time to satisfy that appetite. 3 times a week, I receive visitors. Women from the circle, old friends, young lawyers seeking advice on complicated cases. Once a month, I go to Sacramento to participate in an expanded meeting of our group, which now has branches in several cities in California. Technology helps me keep in touch with loved ones who are far away. I learned to use a cell phone, the internet, social media, although I prefer a good old-fashioned phone call to text messages. I have a small group of friends my age with whom I play bridge on Tuesdays. We drink tea, talk about life and death with the frankness that only old age allows. It's a simple but full life. The scars are still there, physical and emotional. I still have bad days when the memories come back with full force. When I wake up screaming in the middle of the night, I still get tense in enclosed spaces. I still can't stand someone blocking the door of a room where I am. But I have learned to live with these limitations, not to allow them to define who I am or what I can do. When young women seek me out for advice, I try to convey what I have learned on this long and difficult journey. I don't just talk about the horror I lived through. That would only serve to scare them, to instill a paralyzing fear of the world. Instead, I talk about how to navigate this world, maintaining both the openness and the necessary caution. Trust, but verify, I tell them. True love, whether from a friend or a husband, will never want to diminish or control you, will never want to isolate you from the people who matter to you, will never make you feel smaller, weaker, dependent. True love strengthens you, expands you, gives you more freedom, not less. I also talk about the importance of maintaining your own identity, even in the deepest relationships. Never stop being completely yourself. Never give all the keys to your life to another person. Always keep something that is just yours. Knowledge, resources, a space where you are the only owner. And above all, I try to teach about the importance of trusting your own intuition. That little voice inside you that says something is not right, listen to it. That shiver down your spine when someone says or does something that seems strange. Pay attention. Your body and your mind have ancient, instinctive wisdom that picks up on dangers before your reason can process them. The world has changed a lot since the 60 seconds, when I was trafficked, in some ways for the better. Today, there are stricter laws against human trafficking, more public awareness of the problem, more resources for victims. Women have more autonomy, more financial independence, more institutional support when they face violence. In other ways, the danger has just changed form. Human trafficking continues to exist, adapting to new technologies, finding new ways to lure victims. The internet, which brings so many benefits, has also created new ways for predators to find vulnerable people. Social media allows traffickers to build trusting relationships at a distance, preparing the ground for deception. The methods have evolved, but the basic principle remains the same. Identify vulnerabilities and exploit them. It can be economic, emotional, social vulnerability. It can be a young woman in extreme poverty, seeking opportunities, a recently divorced woman looking for connection, a teenager wanting to escape an abusive family. Predators are experts at identifying these weaknesses and presenting themselves as the solution. What gives me hope, however, is seeing how society is less willing to turn a blind eye. When I disappeared in 1969, the subject was almost taboo. Women who disappeared were often blamed. She must have been doing something wrong. She must have run off with some man. Who told her to go out alone? Today there is more empathy, more mobilization, more demand for justice. The support networks are also stronger. When I returned to the United States, I was completely alone, except for a distant cousin I barely knew. Today there are specialized organizations, safe shelters, multidisciplinary teams. It's not perfect, far from it, especially for poor, Black, Indigenous, trans women, but it's better than it was. In moments of despair, when news of new trafficking cases hits me like punches to the stomach, I take my grandmother's necklace. Yes, the same one I hid in the lining of my dress, and that accompanied me throughout my captivity. It's worn. Some beads cracked by time and use, but it remains my talisman, my connection to who I was and who I have become. This necklace lived with me through the worst of humanity. It absorbed my tears in the darkest moments at the Casa Roja, when hope seemed like a cruel illusion. It was a silent witness to the atrocities I suffered and the strength I didn't even know I had. And now, decades later, it continues to be my companion on sleepless nights, on sunny mornings, on the porch, in moments of reflection on the long and tortuous road that brought me here. Sometimes, when I hold it between my fingers, I can almost feel the hands of my grandmother, of my mother, as if there were an invisible thread connecting generations of women in my family. Women who, each in her own way, faced their own battles, carried their own scars, found their own forms of survival and resistance. I am not a religious person in the traditional sense. I have seen too much cruelty to believe in a God who allows such horrors, but I believe in a higher power, an energy that connects all things, all beings. Call it God, universe, nature, destiny. The name matters little. What matters is that in the darkest moments, when all seemed lost, something inside me, and perhaps something beyond me, gave me the strength to keep breathing, not to give up, to believe that there would be an after. And there was an after, full of pain, of struggles, of difficult new beginnings, but also full of small and great victories, of true connections, of purpose found in the ruins of what was destroyed, and after that allowed me to be here at 79, telling my story not as a victim, but as a survivor, as someone who went through hell and came back not only to tell the story, but to extend a hand to others who are still lost in the flames. The journey to forgiveness isn't a straight path. For years I carried the burden of hating Penelope, but that weight only shackled me. True forgiveness wasn't about erasing her sin, but about forgiving myself for the naive 2-3-year-old girl who trusted so blindly. By letting go of that burden, I finally found peace. The scars are still there. They're a part of my story, but they no longer define me. Each of us has our own battles, and sharing them is the first step toward healing. If you want to hear more stories of survival and finding oneself again, subscribe to our channel, because every story shared is a flame lit in the darkness.